I still remember my life as an ordinary office worker, when I believed love could fix everything. Victoria always laughed at me and said, "Ethan, you think too much with your heart." But I never cared because I loved her deeply and believed she would always stay with me. Daniel said, "Bro, you are the luckiest guy alive, marrying a CEO like her." I used to laugh with Daniel, thinking he was just joking like always. Victoria was busy most nights, always working late in her glass office. She would say, "Don't wait for me, Ethan, I have meetings all night." Still, I waited for her every night, believing love needed patience. Daniel started visiting more often, saying he was helping Victoria with business talks. Daniel said, "She trusts me with important decisions. You know that, right?" I felt a strange discomfort, but I ignored it because I trusted both of them. One evening, Victoria received a sealed envelope with an overseas company logo. Victoria said, "This could change everything for my company." Daniel suddenly became serious and told her he would handle everything personally. Daniel said, "You don't need outsiders interfering in this deal." I noticed how protective Daniel sounded, more than I expected from a friend. I looked at Victoria, but she avoided my eyes. I asked, "Is something going on between you two?" Victoria replied, "You're overthinking again, Ethan." But her voice didn't sound as calm as before. I smiled, pretending everything was fine, but inside I felt a crack forming. That night, I sat alone, thinking about everything I had ignored. I told myself I trusted them completely, no matter what. But deep inside, I felt like something was about to break. The next day, Daniel showed up early at my apartment. Daniel said, "We need to talk about Victoria's business future." I frowned because he never spoke like that before. I said, "Since when are you the one handling her future?" Daniel avoided my question and just smiled slightly. Victoria called him trusted partner more often than I liked. Victoria said, "Daniel understands my company better than anyone." I felt my chest tighten every time I heard that, but I kept smiling because I didn't want to look insecure. Later that night, I saw Daniel leaving Victoria's office late. They both looked too serious to be just business partners. Daniel said, "Don't worry, Ethan. It's all under control." I nodded, but my gut told me something was wrong. I didn't know then that my life was already changing. Everything I believed in was about to fall apart. That evening, Victoria came home later than usual. I asked, "Where were you so late again?" Victoria said, "Work, Ethan. Not everything is about you." Her tone felt colder than I had ever heard before. I stayed silent because I didn't want another argument. Daniel texted me later saying, "Trust the process, bro." I stared at that message for a long time, but I still chose to trust them both, even when my heart screamed otherwise. Days passed, and I kept living like nothing was wrong. But inside me, something was slowly breaking every day. Daniel said, "Ethan, you should focus on your job, not us." I laughed nervously, pretending I wasn't worried. But I was starting to lose sleep. Victoria barely spoke to me during dinner. I asked, "Do you still love me?" Victoria said, "Love is complicated, Ethan." That answer hurt more than I expected. I went to bed that night feeling empty. I didn't know my life was about to end as I knew it. The following week, everything started feeling even stranger. Victoria spent more time in her office than ever before. Daniel said, "She needs someone she can fully trust in business." I felt like he was slowly replacing me in her life. Then one evening, I noticed an expensive black car outside our building. Victoria came home holding a sealed envelope with a foreign logo. Victoria said, "This is a life-changing offer for my company." I looked at Daniel and he immediately stepped closer to her. Daniel said, "Let me handle this personally, Victoria." I finally spoke up, trying to understand what was happening. I asked, "Why are you so involved in everything lately?" Victoria said, "Because Daniel understands what I need right now." I felt like I was slowly being pushed out of my own life. I smiled weakly, hiding the fear building inside me. But I still told myself everything would be fine, even when I didn't believe it anymore. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I kept thinking about Victoria and Daniel in silence. I had no idea that betrayal was already standing at my door. The next morning, I tried to act normal. Daniel said, "You look tired, bro." I forced a smile, even though I felt broken inside. Victoria didn't even notice me when she walked past. I stood there watching them talk in whispers again. For the first time, I stopped pretending everything was fine. I knew something in my life was about to end. I stood alone that night, watching the sealed envelope on the table, and I whispered to myself that something inside my perfect world was already breaking, even if I still didn't understand how or why yet at that moment in silence completely. I started noticing the distance between me and Victoria growing every day. "Victoria, can we talk tonight?" I asked. She didn't even look up from her laptop. "I'm busy, Ethan. Not now." I nodded slowly. "You've been saying that a lot lately." Daniel walked into our apartment like he owned the place. "Bro, you still overthinking things?" Daniel laughed. I forced a smile. "I'm not overthinking. I just miss her." Daniel placed his bag down. "She's building an empire. You should be proud, not emotional." I looked at Victoria again. "We used to talk every night." Victoria finally spoke without looking at me. "Things change, Ethan." That one line stayed in my head all night. Later, I saw Daniel sitting in Victoria's office with her. I paused outside the door. Victoria said, "We need to finalize the overseas deal." Daniel replied, "Don't worry. I'll handle the negotiations." I pushed the door slightly. "Why are you handling her deals now?" They both turned. Daniel laughed. "Relax, bro. I'm just helping." Victoria said, "Ethan, you're overreacting again." I stepped back slowly. Something inside me tightened. That night, I asked her again, "Do you still trust me?" Victoria sighed. "Why do you always ask that?" I said, "Because I feel like I'm losing you." She finally looked at me. "You're not losing me. You're just insecure." Those words hurt more than I expected. The next day, Daniel sat beside me. "Let's go out, clear your head," he said. I replied, "I don't feel like it." He smiled. "Come on, like old times." I agreed even though I didn't want to. At the cafe, Daniel said, "You know Victoria is under pressure." I said, "She doesn't even talk to me anymore." Daniel stirred his coffee. "That's because she needs space." I frowned. "Space from me?" He didn't answer directly. Later that week, I came home early. I heard voices inside Victoria's office. I opened the door slowly. Victoria and Daniel were sitting close, serious. I said, "Am I interrupting something?" They both stood up. Daniel laughed again. "Bro, business talk only." Victoria said, "Why are you always suspicious?" I said, "Because I'm not blind." Silence fell between us. Then they both smiled like nothing happened. But I felt it. Something was wrong. Days passed and I couldn't sleep properly. I met Sarah Mitchell outside the building. She looked at me closely. "You look exhausted." I said, "Just work stress." She shook her head. "No, this is emotional stress." I frowned. "Who are you?" She smiled. "Sarah Mitchell, legal advisor." We sat on a bench. She said, "I've seen this before. Emotional red flags are dangerous." I laughed lightly. "You don't know my situation." She said, "I don't need to. I can see it." I said, "I trust my wife and my best friend completely." Sarah looked at me seriously. "Sometimes trust blinds people." I stood up. "Not in my case." But as I walked away, her words stayed with me. That night, I couldn't stop thinking. Victoria was distant. Daniel was everywhere. And I was slowly becoming invisible. I whispered to myself, "Everything is fine." But I didn't believe it anymore. The next morning, I tried acting normal again. "Morning," I said to Victoria. She barely looked at me. "Morning." Daniel was already inside, talking to her about files. I asked, "Did you even sleep here?" Victoria replied, "I was working late." Daniel added, "She pushed herself too hard." I said, "You're always here these days." Daniel smiled. "I'm just helping." I felt my jaw tighten. Helping or replacing me? Silence hit the room. Victoria said sharply, "Ethan, stop this." I stepped back. "I'm just asking questions." Daniel stood up. "Bro, relax. You're imagining things." I turned away. Maybe I am. But I wasn't sure anymore. Later that evening, Sarah texted me, "We need to talk again." I met her near the park. She said, "You're getting worse." I said, "I'm fine." She replied, "No, you're ignoring reality." I looked away. "What reality?" She said, "People don't drift like this without reason." I laughed weakly. "You think my wife is betraying me?" She paused. "I think something is hidden from you." I clenched my fists. "I can't believe that." Sarah stood up. "You don't have to believe me. Just observe." That night, I watched Victoria and Daniel again from a distance. They were laughing. Too close. Too comfortable. I whispered, "This is nothing. It's nothing." But my heart didn't agree. I went back home and sat alone. Daniel sent a message, "Trust us, bro." I stared at it for a long time. I replied nothing. Instead, I said to myself, "I trust them. I trust them." But my voice broke halfway. That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling, hearing every word again and again in my mind, feeling my trust cracking slowly. And even though I kept telling myself nothing was wrong, I finally admitted inside my heart that something between Victoria, Daniel, and me was changing forever, and I could not stop it anymore now, no matter how hard I tried. I came home early that night because I wanted to surprise Victoria. I had flowers in my hand and a small smile on my face. I whispered to myself, "She'll be happy today. She'll finally smile again." I opened the door slowly. "I'm home," I said softly. No answer. I walked inside. Then I heard voices from the living room. Victoria and Daniel. I stopped. My heart slowed down. I moved closer quietly. I saw them. Victoria was sitting too close to Daniel. Not like business. Not like friends. Something else. I stepped forward. "Victoria?" I said. They both turned. Silence hit the room instantly. Daniel stood up first. "Bro!" I dropped the flowers slightly. "What is this?" Victoria didn't move. She looked at me, but not like before. Not warm. Not mine. I said again, "Tell me what I'm seeing." Daniel looked away. Victoria finally spoke. "Ethan, you weren't supposed to come early." My hands started shaking. I said, "So I ruined something?" Victoria stood up slowly. "No," she said. "You just saw the truth." My breath stopped. I whispered, "Truth." Daniel said quietly, "Let me explain." I looked at him. "Explain what?" He hesitated. Victoria interrupted. "I feel trapped, Ethan." I froze completely. "What?" I asked. She said it again, colder. "I feel trapped in this marriage." Those words hit me harder than anything in my life. I stepped back. I said, "Trapped by me?" Victoria looked away. "It's not like that." I laughed once, but it broke halfway. "Then what is it like?" Daniel spoke softly. "We understand each other better." I turned to him instantly. "You what?" He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "It just happened." My chest burned. I said, "You're my best friend." Daniel looked down. "I know." I turned back to Victoria. "You promised me forever." She looked at me now, and she said, "Forever changes." That moment felt like my world cracked open. I whispered, "So this is it?" Victoria nodded slowly. Daniel said, "Ethan, don't make this harder." I shouted, "Harder? You're inside my life." Silence again. Victoria walked toward the table. She removed her ring. Slowly. No emotion. She placed it down. Clink. That sound destroyed me. She said, "I choose my future." I couldn't breathe properly. I said, "Your future with him?" She didn't answer directly, but she didn't deny it. Daniel stepped closer to her. I said, "Daniel, don't." He looked at me once. "I'm sorry," he said, but he didn't sound sorry. Victoria picked up her bag. She said, "Ethan, we tried." I shook my head fast. No, we didn't. She walked past me. Daniel followed her. I stepped in front of them. Stop, I said. Victoria said, move. I didn't move. Daniel touched my shoulder. Bro, it's over. I pushed his hand away. I said, over? You think this is just over? Victoria looked at me one last time. No tears. No regret. Just distance. Then she walked out. Daniel followed her. I stood there, frozen. My body didn't move. My mind didn't understand. The door closed. Click. That sound felt final. I ran to the door and slammed it open. Victoria, I shouted. No answer. Daniel. Silence. Empty hallway. I screamed again. Come back. No one came. My voice echoed back at me. I fell to my knees. I whispered, this isn't real. But it was. I punched the floor. Why? No answer. Only silence. I sat there for a long time. Flowers still in my hand. Crushed. I looked at the ring on the table. I picked it up. My hands were shaking. I said softly, you really left. That night, everything I believed in died inside me. Love, trust, friendship, all gone in one moment. I sat alone in the dark. No phone calls, no footsteps, nothing, just me, and the silence that replaced my whole life. I don't even remember how I got through the first week after they left me. I just remember silence and loss. My apartment felt shush now. Every corner whispered her name. I stood in the empty room and said, so this is what I became. No answer came back. My phone kept ringing at first. Then it stopped. Blocked. Everywhere. Victoria blocked me. Daniel blocked me. Even people who used to smile at me stopped replying. I laughed once, bitterly. So I don't exist anymore? I said to myself. The company I worked for called me in. My manager didn't even look at me properly. He said, Ethan, we're restructuring. I frowned. What does that mean? He sighed. Your position is no longer required. I stared at him. I said, is this because of Victoria Hayes? He hesitated. That was enough answer. I nodded slowly. Of course, I said. I walked out without another word. Outside, I stood in the street feeling nothing. No anger, just emptiness. I whispered, she really erased me. Days passed like that. I stopped eating properly. Stopped answering calls that didn't exist anymore. Every place I went felt wrong. Even coffee shops. Even streets. Everything reminded me of her. One night I sat alone on the floor. I said out loud, what did I do wrong? Silence answered again. I laughed softly. I gave everything. My voice broke. And still wasn't enough. I didn't know how long I stayed like that. Time didn't matter anymore. Then one evening, I saw Daniel's message pop up for a second. Then it disappeared. Blocked again. I closed my eyes. Even you, I whispered. That was the moment I realized something inside me was dying. Not just my life. Me. The next morning I packed a small bag. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay. The city felt like a cage now. Every street felt like a memory I didn't want. I walked without direction until I reached an old park. That's where I met him. An old man sitting alone on a bench. He looked at me like he already knew everything. He said, you look like someone who lost something important. I frowned. I lost everything. He nodded slowly. Same thing. I sat down beside him without thinking. I said, nothing makes sense anymore. He replied, it doesn't have to. I looked at him. Who are you? He smiled slightly. William Harris. I sighed. I don't need advice. He said calmly, good. I'm not giving advice. I looked away. He continued, I'm just telling you what I learned. I stayed quiet. He said, pain is the beginning of power if you survive it. I laughed once. Empty. Power, I said. I don't even have a life. William looked at me. You still have yourself. I shook my head. I don't know who that is anymore. He leaned forward slightly. Then find him again. I stood up immediately. I don't have time for this. I started walking away. He said behind me, "Running won't fix what broke you." I stopped, but I didn't turn. He added, "But staying like this will destroy you completely." I clenched my fists. Then I walked away, but his words stayed inside my head. That night, I slept on a cheap motel bed. No calls, no messages, just silence again. I stared at the ceiling and whispered, "What am I supposed to do now?" No answer, only darkness. Days turned into weeks like that. I sold what little I had left. I stopped trying to contact anyone. There was no one left anyway. One morning, I looked at myself in the mirror. I didn't recognize the man staring back. I said, "So this is what losing everything looks like." My voice was calm now. Too calm. I sat down and thought about William's words again. Pain is the beginning of power. I shook my head. No, that's not me. But something inside me didn't agree anymore. That same day, I left the city completely. No goodbye, no destination, just disappearance. As the bus moved away, I looked out the window and said softly, "If I survive this, I won't be the same man again." And for the first time since the betrayal, I wasn't sure if that scared me or saved me. I left the city without telling anyone where I was going. Not Victoria, not Daniel, not even the version of me I used to be. I sat in the bus and whispered, "No one is coming back for me anymore." The road felt endless. When I arrived, the place was nothing like my old life. Small office, old building, quiet streets. That's where I saw him again. William Harris. He looked at me and said, "So you came back?" I replied, "I had nowhere else to go." He nodded. "That's the best place to start." I frowned. "Start what?" He turned and walked inside. "A new life." I followed him without thinking. Inside, everything felt simple but strict. He said, "From today, you don't complain. You work." I said, "I already lost everything." He replied, "Good. Now you can learn." I stared at him. "That's not motivation." He looked at me sharply. "It's reality." The first days were brutal. Long hours. No comfort. No sympathy. I said one night, "Why are you pushing me like this?" William replied, "Because you're still weak." I clenched my fists. "I survived betrayal, not weakness." He said, "Then survive pressure too." I stayed silent, because I had no answer. Every task felt heavier than the last. I almost quit twice, but William always stopped me. "You run again, you stay broken," he said. I replied, "Maybe I am broken." He said, "Then rebuild." Slowly, I stopped arguing. Slowly, I started listening. One day, he threw me into real business planning. "Analyze this company," he said. I frowned. "I'm not trained for this." He said, "You think anyone is born trained?" I worked all night. Numbers, reports, mistakes. But something inside me started waking up again. Not pain, focus. The next morning, William looked at my work. He said, "Better." I asked, "That's it?" He nodded. For now. That was the first time I felt I wasn't completely useless. Weeks passed like that. Work, pressure, silence. Then one afternoon, everything changed. William said, "We have a guest." I looked up. "Who?" He replied, "Investor." A man walked in wearing a clean suit, calm eyes, strong presence. William said, "This is Richard Cole." Richard looked at me for a moment, then said, "You're not from around here." I replied, "I'm not from anywhere anymore." He smiled slightly. "That sounds dangerous." I said, "It is." He sat down and started asking questions. Not normal questions, deep ones. How do you handle loss? What do you do when trust breaks? I hesitated. Then I said, "I stopped trusting." Richard nodded slowly. "That's why you're interesting." William watched silently. Richard leaned forward. "I'm building a small project. I need someone who understands pressure." I frowned. "Why me?" He said, "Because you don't look like someone who quits anymore." I laughed once. "You don't know me," he replied. "I know enough." He placed a file on the table. William said, "It's your choice." I stared at the file. My hands didn't move at first. Then I asked, "What if I fail?" Richard said, "Then you learn." William added, "Or you stay where you are." Silence. I closed my eyes for a second. Victoria's face flashed in my mind. Daniel's voice. Everything I lost. I opened my eyes.
I accept, he sighed.
Richard nodded. Good. That moment felt small. But it wasn't. It was the first step out of my grave. Work with Richard wasn't easy. He was strict, direct, unforgiving. He said, "If you hesitate, you lose." I said, "I'm still learning." He replied, "Then learn faster." William watched me grow from a distance. One day he said, "You're changing." I said, "I don't feel like it." He replied, "That's because real change doesn't feel like comfort." I stayed quiet, because he was right. Slowly, I started making decisions without fear. I stopped asking permission from my past. I stopped looking back. One evening, Richard said, "You see patterns others miss." I asked, "Is that good?" He smiled. "It's powerful." That word stayed in my head. Power. Not revenge. Not pain. Power. For the first time, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like something else. Not healed, but rebuilding. At night, I sat alone and said, "I don't know who I'm becoming." And for the first time, that didn't scare me. It felt like possibility. William once told me, "You're not starting over." I asked, "Then what am I doing?" He said, "You're becoming someone they can't recognize anymore." I didn't answer, but I understood. And I didn't stop. "Sir, the numbers are ready." I looked up from my desk. Emily Scott stood there holding a file, calm and precise. I said, "You don't need to call me sir all the time." She replied, "Richard told me to respect hierarchy." I leaned back. "Richard also likes people who think freely." She paused, then said, "Then I'll try that." I nodded slightly. Good. That was my first real interaction with her. Not formal, not cold, just real. Years had passed since I left everything behind, and I wasn't the same man anymore. Richard Cole's voice came through the speaker. "Ethan, report to the meeting room." I stood up. Emily followed me. She said quietly, "You don't seem nervous anymore." I replied, "Nervous people lose." She looked at me. "Or they learn." I smiled faintly. Good answer. In the meeting room, Richard was already waiting. He said, "You're late." I said, "I was reviewing the acquisition data." He nodded once. "Better excuse than last time." Emily sat beside me, silent. Richard said, "We're expanding. Bigger stakes now." I asked, "Risk level?" He looked at me. "High," I replied. "Then we do it carefully." He smiled slightly. "That's not the Ethan I met years ago." I said, "That one died." Silence filled the room. Emily glanced at me but said nothing. After the meeting, she walked beside me. She said, "You talk about yourself like you're gone." I replied, "Part of me is." She asked, "Does it ever hurt?" I stopped walking, then said, "It used to." She didn't push further. That was why I trusted her. She didn't force questions. She just stayed. Days turned into months, then years. Work became everything. Deals, strategy, expansion. Richard once said, "You think like me now." I replied, "I think like someone who survived." He nodded. Same thing. Emily became more than an assistant. She handled my schedule, my meetings, my silence. One night, she said, "You never take breaks." I said, "Breaks are for people who have time to fall apart." She looked at me carefully. "You already fell apart once?" I didn't answer immediately. Then I said, "I don't do that anymore." She replied softly, "Maybe that's why you never heal." I looked at her. "Don't analyze me," I said. She nodded. "Sorry." But she didn't stop caring. That was the difference. One evening, Richard called me alone. He said, "You're ready for bigger control." I asked, Control of what? He replied. Your own division. I stayed silent for a moment, then said, Give it to me. He smiled. That's what I expected. That night, I stood on the balcony of my new office. City lights below me. Emily came out behind me. She said, You built all this from nothing. I replied, From loss. She asked, Do you ever look back? I said, I don't have time to. She said quietly, That sounds lonely. I didn't answer, because she was right. But I didn't care anymore. News started spreading. Fast. Richard Cole expands empire. New rising strategist behind success. I never reacted. I never needed to. Then one day, Emily entered my office quickly. She said, There's something you should know. I looked up. What? She hesitated. It's about Victoria Hayes. I didn't react immediately. Then I said, Say it. She placed a folder on the table. She's struggling. Company collapsing. Daniel left her. I leaned back, silent. Emily watched me closely. You're not reacting. I said, Should I? She replied, I thought you would care. I looked at the window, then said, I care about my future. She stayed quiet. That was the truth. Victoria was no longer part of it. Not even pain anymore. Just memory. Richard later said, You've changed completely. I replied, No. He asked, Then what happened? I said, I stopped bleeding. Emily overheard and said softly, That's not the same as being whole. I didn't reply, because I knew she was right, but I still didn't stop. Years ago I was broken. Now I was building, and nothing from my past could touch me anymore. I didn't return to the business world. I took it back. That's what it felt like when my name started appearing in headlines. New investor reshaping market strategies. Rising figure under Richard Cole's network. Emily placed the newspaper on my desk. She said, You're everywhere now. I didn't look up. And, she replied, You used to disappear. Now people look for you. I said, Let them. Richard called me that morning. Ethan, you're getting attention. I replied, That was the goal. He said, Be careful. Attention creates enemies. I said, I already have enough history for that. He laughed slightly. Good answer. Emily stood nearby and said, You sound more distant lately. I replied, Distance helps clarity. She frowned. Or isolation. I didn't respond, because she wasn't wrong. Then it happened. A meeting invitation arrived. Unknown sender. High-level investors conference. Emily said, It's unusual. I said, Everything important is. I went anyway. The room was full of people I didn't care about, until I heard a voice. Ethan Carter. I turned slowly. A man stood up across the table. Sharp suit. Confident eyes. He said, I didn't expect you to rise this fast. I replied, I didn't expect you to matter at all. A few people looked shocked. He smiled. I'm Oliver Grant. I nodded once. Doesn't ring anything important. He laughed. It will. The room went quiet. Emily, sitting behind me, whispered, He's a major competitor. I said softly, Then he should speak carefully. Oliver leaned forward. I heard you work under Cole. That means you're trained, not independent. I replied, I heard you talk too much. A few people chuckled. Oliver didn't move. He said, Let's see if your numbers match your attitude. I said, They always do. The meeting started. But it wasn't a meeting. It was a challenge. Every proposal I presented, he questioned. Every strategy he attacked. I stayed calm. Emily whispered, He's trying to shake you. I said, He won't. Richard watched from the side. Silent. After the meeting, Oliver stopped me outside. He said, You're good, but you're emotionally empty. I looked at him. That's called control. He smiled. Or damage. I stepped closer. Watch your tone. He didn't back away. I like you, Ethan. You're interesting. I replied, I don't care what you like. He said, You should. Because we're going to compete for everything you're building. I nodded. Then compete. I walked away. Emily followed me quickly. She said, "He's dangerous." I replied, "Everyone is." She said, "Not like him." I stopped walking. "Focus on work," I said. She nodded slowly, but I could feel her worry behind me. Days passed after that. My name kept rising. More headlines, more deals, more pressure. Richard said, "You're becoming a target now." I replied, "Good. Targets mean importance." He studied me. "You've changed completely." I said, "No. I just stopped reacting." Emily added quietly, "That's not the same thing." I didn't answer, because I already knew. Then one evening, she entered my office again. Her face was different. She said, "You should see this." I looked at her. "What now?" She placed her phone on the desk. News article. My eyes scanned it. Victoria Hayes Company collapsing. Daniel Brooks officially resigns. I stayed still. Emily watched me carefully. "You're not reacting again." I said, "There's nothing to react to." She said softly, "That was your past." I replied, "Exactly." Silence filled the room. I stood up and walked to the window. City below me again. Different city now. Different life. Emily said, "Don't you feel anything?" I said, "I feel focus." She whispered, "That's not human." I turned slightly. "It's necessary." She looked down. I went back to my desk and continued working. That night, Richard called. He said, "Oliver Grant is pushing into your sector." I replied, "Let him try." He said, "He wants war." I said, "Then he'll get strategy." After the call, I sat alone. No anger, no excitement, just stillness. I realized something then. Victoria's name didn't hurt anymore. Daniel didn't echo in my mind anymore. Even betrayal felt far away. Emily stood at the door quietly. She said, "You've become someone else entirely." I replied, "I had no choice." She asked, "Was it worth it?" I looked at her for a long moment, then said, "I'm still standing." She didn't respond, but I saw it in her eyes. She wasn't sure if that was victory or loss, and neither was I anymore. Emily placed a folder on my desk and said, "You need to see this." I didn't look up. "If it's another market report, leave it." She hesitated. "It's not." I finally glanced at her. "Then what is it?" She slid the folder closer. "It's from Hayes Corporation." My hand paused for a second. Then I opened it. Victoria Hayes. My name appeared in her internal memo. I read it once, then again. Emily watched me closely. "She knows," I said calmly. "So?" She said, "She didn't just find out. She's reacting strongly." I closed the folder. "That's her problem." Emily frowned. "Ethan." I cut her off. "Focus on work." She didn't move. I added, "I said focus." She nodded slowly and stepped back. But I knew she wasn't convinced. Later that day, Richard called me. "Hayes Corporation is unstable," he said. I replied, "I've heard." He said, "She's trying to recover, and she knows you're involved in the market shift." I stayed quiet. Richard added, "She wants a meeting." I said, "No." He paused. "That was quick." I replied, "There's nothing to discuss." He said, "You sure?" "Emotional history clouds business decisions." I said, "I don't have emotional history anymore." Richard chuckled lightly. "Good answer." But after the call, I stayed silent longer than usual. Emily entered again. She said, "She sent another request." I said, "Ignore it." She hesitated. "It's personal this time." I looked at her sharply. "I don't do personal." She lowered her voice. "It's Victoria herself asking." That name. Still nothing inside me moved, but something echoed faintly. I said, "Still no." Emily nodded, but her eyes studied me. Days passed. Requests kept coming. Emails, official letters, even indirect offers. Victoria Hayes was trying to reach me through every channel. Emily said, "She's desperate." I replied, "She's adapting." She asked, "Aren't you curious?" I said, "Curiosity is a weakness in business." She sighed, "You've turned everything into strategy." I said, "That's how I survived." Then one afternoon, Daniel appeared again. Not in my office, not in my world, but through a message that Emily showed me. "Ethan, please talk to me." I stared at it. Emily said, "He's been trying for weeks." I said, "Delete it." She hesitated. "You don't want to respond?" I said, "No." She looked at me carefully. "Not even anger?" I replied, "Not even memory." She didn't push further, but I saw concern in her eyes again. That evening, Richard called a meeting. He said, "Victoria is losing control of her company." I replied, "Then she should restructure." He said, "She asked specifically for you to consult." I said, "Denied." Richard paused. That firm rejection again. I said, "Consistency matters." He laughed softly. "Or avoidance." I didn't respond. After the call, I stood near the window. Emily joined me quietly. She said, "You're not even curious about her anymore?" I said, "No." She asked softly, "Not even a little?" I looked at the city lights, then said, "Curiosity leads back." She nodded slowly. "Back to what?" I didn't answer, because I knew. Back to pain. Back to weakness. Back to the man I buried. Then Emily said, "She's not the same person either." I replied, "Neither am I." She looked at me. "Then why does it feel like something unfinished?" I said, "Because people want stories to end emotionally." She asked, "And yours?" I said, "Mine ended when I stopped needing them." Silence followed. Later that night, I received a private message. Unknown number. "I know it's you. Please meet me once. Victoria." I stared at it. Long. Still. Emily saw it on my screen. She said quietly, "You don't have to answer." I said, "I won't." She asked, "Not even to close the past?" I said, "The past is already closed." But I didn't delete it immediately. I just looked at it. For the first time in years, her name didn't hurt. It only felt distant, like something that once existed in another life. Emily said softly, "That's growth." I replied, "No." She looked at me. I said, "That's freedom." And for the first time, I believed it. "Sir, she's here." Emily's voice was calm, but I felt the weight in it. I looked up from my desk. "Who?" She replied softly, "Victoria Hayes." I leaned back slowly. "I didn't approve this meeting." Emily said, "She insisted on waiting outside. She said she won't leave." I stayed silent for a moment. Then I said, "Let her in." The door opened, and she walked in. Not the same woman I once knew. No confidence. No sharp CEO presence. Just exhaustion. Her voice trembled slightly. "Ethan." I didn't stand up. "You came a long way for that." She looked at me like she was searching for the old version of me. "I needed to see you," she said. I replied, "You are seeing me." She stepped closer. "No. This isn't you anymore." I said calmly, "It is." Silence filled the room. She swallowed hard. "I lost everything." I nodded once. "I heard." Her eyes filled. "Daniel left me too." I replied, "That happens when trust breaks." She shook her head. "You don't understand." I interrupted, "I understand perfectly." She took a shaky breath. "Ethan, I made a mistake." I said nothing. She stepped forward. "The biggest mistake of my life." Her voice cracked. "I left you. I destroyed us. I thought I was choosing better. But I lost everything." Still, I stayed quiet. She reached into her bag and pulled out her old ring. The same one she left on my table years ago. "I kept it," she whispered. "I don't know why." I looked at it. No emotion rose. She said, "Please, just say something." I finally spoke. "What do you want me to say?" She stepped closer, desperate now. Tell me there's still something left. I shook my head slightly. There isn't. Her breath stopped. She whispered, You don't feel anything at all? I answered honestly, I feel calm. That hurt her more than anger would have. She shook her head again. I can fix this. I can leave everything behind. I can. I raised my hand slightly. Stop. She froze. I continued, You're not here to fix anything. You're here because you lost control of your life. Tears rolled down her face. I lost you. I said quietly, You didn't lose me. You chose to leave me. Silence again. Heavy. Final. She whispered, I thought you'd hate me. I replied, I did once. She looked up quickly. And now? I stood up slowly. Now I don't need to. Her voice broke. Ethan, please. I looked at her one last time. Not anger. Not love. Just distance. Then I said, I've already moved forward. She shook her head. You can't just erase everything we had. I replied, I didn't erase it. I outgrew it. That hit her harder than anything. Her hands dropped. She whispered, So this is it? I nodded. Yes. She stepped back slowly. I ruined everything. I said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. She stood there waiting. For anger. For pain. For something. But I had nothing left to give her. Only peace. She finally turned around. Slowly walked toward the door. She stopped once. Didn't look back. Then she left. The door closed. Soft. Final. Emily stood quietly in the corner. She said softly, You didn't even flinch. I replied, There was nothing left to break. She asked, Do you regret it? I looked at the window. City outside. Bright. Alive. Then I said, No. She frowned. Not even a little? I shook my head. No. She whispered, Then what do you feel? I answered after a pause. Peace. I walked past her. Out of the office. Out of the past. And I realized something simple. I didn't win by hurting them. I won by becoming someone they could never touch again. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't running. I was free.